Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, class. Well, this is the module for April 20th and April 27th. We're going to spend 2 weeks looking at World War II. So, what I'm going to do is, first video is going to be kind of the background in Europe leading up to the war. And then after that, we'll kind of get into World War II itself. I'm not entirely sure how many lecture videos this is going to end up being. We're also going to have a special section about propaganda, where I'll have a couple of things for you to watch that are American propaganda. Uh, Hopefully, you've seen the announcement. What I've decided to do with the document analysis, instead of giving you a couple of documents to analyze, I want you to choose a document that is at least 5 pages long, from any period in American history that we cover here. So, Reconstruction to the year 2000 ish, and about 2 pages typed. No specific style. Just critique the document. What's the document about? What's it say about the time period in which it was written? Um, Try to kind of simplify it. Hopefully, I've done that. All right. So, World War II. The war to end all wars, the second one. Where do we start? Well, not surprisingly, we start at the end of the last war and we start with the 1920s in Europe. So, the Treaty of Versailles had left many nations unhappy. There were a lot of border disputes. The Germans saw the peace as dictated and sought revision. The League of Nations was not very effective as the United States stayed out. Plus, it could only level economic sanctions. France was left alone. They didn't have British support, US support, or Soviet Russia support. France will sign defensive alliances with Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Big countries, but militarily weak. So, France was deathly afraid of Germany violating the treaty. And they decided the best way was to strictly enforce the treaty like a bunch of jerks. So, April 1921, that's when it was determined that Germany would pay 132 billion marks in reparation, about $33 billion. Annual installments of 2.5 billion would be paid in gold marks. Germany agrees to do this the first year they pay. They agreed to do it because the French threatened to take over the Ruhr Valley, which the Ruhr Valley was their economic industrial area. After the first year, they announced they could pay no further. So the French just said, "Oh, you're going to pay us." And they sent troops into the Ruhr Valley, where the German government passively resisted. The German government just began printing more and more money, which led to intensified inflation. Excuse me. The German mark basically becomes worthless. In 1914, the exchange rate was 4.2 German marks to the US dollar. Not bad, about what the franc was. On November 1st, 1923, the exchange rate was 130 billion marks to the dollar. It got worse after that, 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. Germany is going to have some uprisings. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the rise of Hitler. France will lose a great deal in the occupation after pressure from Great Britain and the United States. France backs down and agrees to a new conference to reassess reparations. This will cause Germany and France to approach each other in a different light for a little while. And that leads us to what were called the hopeful years, from 24 to 29, when it looked like the two nations might actually get along. And as we talked before about some of the things that came out of that, the Calais-Briand Pact, heavy industrialization, heavy investment in Europe from the U.S., things like that. So what brings this all to a crashing halt? Well, the Great Depression. I don't need to go over that again. But I will say this. Democracy seemed to be failing. I said that before in the last video. In Europe, only a few nations like France and Great Britain and some minor ones remain democratic. By 1939, Italy and Germany will become fascist. The Soviet Union will become a dictatorship under Joseph Stalin. Eastern Europe will become more and more authoritarian. And totalitarian governments began to expect the complete support of its people. They will use propaganda and radio to reach their goals. Generally, they will be led by a single leader or party who is ruthless, who will use their police forces. Now, what we need to do is look at these specific countries, specifically Italy and Germany. Talk a little bit about Russia, not too much. I'll try to include a biography of Stalin. Okay, so what's going on in Italy? 700,000 Italian soldiers died in World War One. They spent 148 billion lira on the war. In American money, that's 85,936,471.83. They gained some territory, but they felt cheated. The inflation hurt the middle class. Demobilization led to high unemployment. Groups of veterans were very unhappy. The government could not deal with these problems. In Italy and in a lot of countries around the world, they have a parliamentary system with more than two parties. And in the best of times, it's hard for a party to get a working majority. You always have to have coalitions. Well, during terrible times like this, it's very hard to get different factions to work together. So you have a lot of instability. And the person who will jump in and really take advantage of this is a man named Benito Mussolini, who will live from 1883 to 1943. As a child, he was described to be a brat. He received a diploma to be an elementary teacher. Insert fascist teacher joke here. He becomes a socialist. In 1912, he was the editor of the Avante. He supported intervention in World War I and was expelled by the Socialist Party. In 1919, he began a new party that would be known as the Fascists. It's actually called the Fascio di Combattimento, or the League of Combat. They did not do very well in the elections of 1919, but a political stalemate saved his party. A new parliament was unable to form a government. The three major parties, the Socialists, Liberals, and Christian Democrats, could not join and make a coalition because the Socialists kept speaking of the necessity for revolution. Conservatives were concerned. Thousands of industrial and agricultural strikes occurred in 1919 and 1920. There was class warfare and violence. Mussolini shifts his party to the right. Fascism is a right-wing party. Now, generally, with ideology, there's a lot of confusion about what fascism is. It's considered to be extreme right wing, while communism is extreme left wing. But if you look at the two in their extremes, they seem very similar. And really, the reason is because ideology isn't a straight line, it's more of a circle where you have the extreme left and extreme right at the top, and then you got in the middle at the bottom kind of democracy. So that's why, there seems to be some similarities. So, Mussolini is able to gain the support of industrialists and large landowners, and also began to tap into the feelings of being left out after the war. He also begins to use force against the left. This made him very popular for the upcoming elections. In 1920 and 21, there were bands of armed fascists called the Squadristi, who began attacking socialist offices, newspapers, and strikes. Mussolini then allied himself with the liberals in parliament under their prime minister. The liberals thought that they could use the fascists to destroy the socialists and then get rid of them when the time came. This arrangement allowed Mussolini to gain political respectability, freed him up for more violence. In May of 21, the fascists won 35 seats, 7% of the seats in the parliament. By 1921, Mussolini had 200,000 black shirts and squadrons. Veterans and students were attracted to his cause. One thing they would do is they would grab people, hold them down, and pour castor oil down their throats. Mussolini felt that terrorism would result in political victory. He deliberately created sources of conflict. Fascism, you see, flourishes in chaos. He called the fascists the party of order and was supported by the middle and upper class, white collar, and civil servants. Fear of communism made them more popular. Mussolini is sick of trying this democracy stuff, and so he plans a march on Rome with his followers. He said, quote, either we are allowed to govern or we will seize power by marching on Rome. This was, of course, a bluff, but the king, Victor Emmanuel III, capitulated on October 29th, 1922. The king made Mussolini prime minister. 24 hours later, his squadron of black shirts were allowed to march into Rome in triumph to create the myth of a civil war. This was something, a triumph had its ties to the ancient Roman Republic. They would have these great parades and things to honor great military generals. Mussolini does the same thing here, except for he didn't have a slave whispering in his ear that Rome was greater than he. So, the myth of the Civil War. Now Mussolini and his followers says, we are the party of the future. We have just won the Italian Civil War. Now people might ask, what war? And the answer would be, the one we just won, duh. And so Mussolini has become the head of the parliament, the head of the government. Now Mussolini had to move slowly because his party was in the minority. In 1923, he prepared for national elections. In July of 1923, the parliament passed what was called the Acerbo Law. Now, you might wonder why anyone would agree to this, and I'm with you here. It said that any party who received 25% of the votes would be given 2/3 of the seats in parliament. Now, you gotta wonder, why would you agree to that? Do you think you could get the 25% and others can, or do you think no one can? Seems very dicey. So, election, April 1924. Big victory for the fascists. They actually win 65% of the vote. They get their 2/3 of the seats. There was some voter intimidation and fraud, but not quite enough to, obviously the fascists were winning. By 1926, there was a fascist dictatorship under Mussolini. Press laws were enacted to kill negative press. The prime minister became head of government and could now legislate with decree, no longer even needing parliament. The police could now arrest and confine without due process. In 1926, anti-fascist parties were banned. The secret police, the OVRA, was established. Mussolini became known as Il Duce, the leader. Now, they will never be as repressive as Nazi Germany. He used mass media to get to the masses. Simple slogans like Mussolini is always right. They will not achieve their major goals. He tries to mold society into one homogeneous group with a single identity. Basically, let me show you how fascism is supposed to work. Everyone is supposed to be living for the state. One person, an individual, is weak and breakable. If you combined people into the state, into obedience to the state, where everyone is part of the machine, they use the old Roman symbol of the fasces, bound together sticks. If everyone is bound together, one identity, that's unbreakable. That's the goal of fascism. They will create educational policy, develop fascist organizations. Secondary education, however, remained independent, so they relied on youth organizations like the Young Fascists to indoctrinate the youth. By 1939, 6.8 million children between the ages of 8 and 18 were in these youth groups, about 60% of that age bracket. What tended to happen is teenagers decided to not do it. You know how teenagers are. So it wasn't as effective as they wanted to. It included marching drills, summer camps, competitions. It was to foster militarization. In the 1930s, all male groups were given pre military exercise regiments used to develop discipline, to train for war. Many teenagers refused to attend. They wanted to create a whole, what the fascists wanted to do is create a whole society. They wanted women to support their families. Families, they said, were the pillar of the community. They eliminated women from the workforce. They enacted laws to limit women's rights, to gave prizes for fertility. Now, they won't have as much control as, say, Hitler and Nazi Germany, because the fascists will not absorb the monarchy or the military, and were forced to recognize the independence of Vatican City to gain Catholic support. In fact, they had to make Catholicism the religion of the state. Mussolini will never deliver as much as he promised. So, that's the fascist state beginnings under Mussolini. Next, let's talk about Adolf Hitler and his rise to power in Germany. In Germany, after the war, you had the Weimar Republic. Its problem is it didn't have a lot of good political leaders. Its best leaders tended to have died in the 1920s. In 1925, Paul von Hindenburg, you may remember him from the war, was elected president in 1925. Hindenburg was a monarchist. He did not believe in the republic, but he was a German nationalist, so he did the best he could. He suffered from uprisings from both the left and the right, and have faced severe economic problems. The inflations of 22 and 23 had major repercussions, especially for those on fixed incomes. It pushed many in the middle class over to the right, kind of to fascism, again, because of a fear of communism. During the Great Depression, unemployment was 4.4 million by December of 1930. In Germany, there was a lot of discontent and fear. This made it possible for Hitler to come to power. Adolf Hitler. Born in 1889, he was the son of an Austrian customs official. He was a failure in school. He went to Vienna to become an artist, where he was rejected by the Academy of Arts. Hitler then stayed in Vienna, where he led a bohemian lifestyle. He called 1908 to 1913 his formative years, and that's where he claimed to have come to his philosophy during that time. Hitler learned from the mayor of Vienna, was influenced by the anti-Semitic Christian Social Party, and he saw the mayor of Vienna appeal time and time again with emotional appeals. He learned anti-Jewish sentiment from a former monk and was influenced by the operas of Richard Wagner. About the play of the Valkyries being his most famous. If you grew up with Bugs Bunny, you know it. Kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit. That's Wagner, except for different words. The core belief he will come to is racism, especially toward Jews. He became a German nationalist. He learned how to use propaganda and terror. In 1913, Hitler moved to Munich. He entered the army and became a dispatch runner on the Western Front. Toward the end of the war, and this might sound like a DC supervillain origin story, he was subject to a gas attack and was temporarily blinded and spent time in a hospital. While in the hospital, he was recruited by the police to infiltrate the Nazi Party. He joined the German Workers' Party. He liked what he saw, and by 1921, he assumed control of the party. He renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi. He worked to turn the movement into a large political party. He brought in flags, badges, uniforms, and their own newspaper. They had their own police force. The militia was called the SA or the Stormtroopers. Yes, that's where George Lucas got that from. George Lucas isn't very subtle. The SA, the Stormtroopers, defended the party at mass meetings and broke up the meetings of other parties. Hitler was great at oration and was able to attract many new members. Membership grew to 55,000 in the Nazi Party with 15,000 stormtroopers. By 1923, they were the strongest right wing party. In the fall of 23, he decided to march on Berlin to overthrow the government. Now, what was supposed to happen was it was supposed to be the Nazis and other right wing parties. They were going to get together and march en masse. Well, basically, what happened is Hitler's calling these dudes up and saying, "Hey, man, you ready to go?" The other groups are like, "Oh, man, was that today? I'm sorry. I got this other thing. We can't storm the government with you today. Maybe we can reschedule. You never know, right?" Well, Hitler decided to um, and the Nazis decided to go at it alone. Now, instead of marching on the government, they staged an armed uprising in Munich on November 8th, 1923, called the Beer Hall Putsch. It was quickly crushed by the government. Hitler was arrested and he will be put on trial. It will become a show trial because the judge that Hitler has will very much favor him. Now, ultimately, what happens is Hitler is convicted of treason, but he's only given 5 years of prison. And prison for Hitler was not like prison for other people. His cell was hardly ever locked. He ate dinner with the warden. He had visitors whenever he wanted. And it just basically gave him time to write his book. So while in prison, he decided to use constitutional means to infiltrate and lead the government. He decided that the Nazis would become a political party to compete for votes. While in prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, which will explain his views on for the Nazi Party. Now, fortunately for him, I guess Joseph Goebbels helped him write it. Hitler was very much a stream of consciousness writer. Apparently, he just kept wanting to write about syphilis. But what he wrote in this book, and this is why you can't say if you were German you didn't know what Hitler was going to do, because he made it very clear. It was the search for Lebensraum, living space. He wanted more space for superior Aryan individuals, that's the Germans. No one took him very seriously. Hitler reestablished his control over the party after he left prison. The party now decides to follow the Führer and the leadership principle, meaning that political parties have political ideas and political flanks. In other words, there are planks, There are things that a party believes. Now, not everyone in the party necessarily believes in every part of it. Well, the Nazis are like, we don't need planks. We just need the Führer. And whatever the Führer believes in is what the party believes in. And thus, that's the new Nazi party. He reorganized the party and expanded into other parts of Germany. By 1929, there is a major national party organization with 178,000 members by 1929. He would basically go around the country by plane, tell people, different groups what they wanted to hear, never getting away from what he believed in. But if he was in an area that hated Jews, he talked more about hating Jews and how bad they were. If they're in an area where Jews were not hated, toned it down a little bit, basically just telling groups what they wanted to hear. This movement appealed to the youth of Germany, especially those under 30. This was often called a young man's movement. Now, the 1928 election did not go very well for the Nazis. They received 2.6% of the votes and 12 seats in the Reichstag. Hitler began courting the middle class and lower middle class voters in small towns and rural areas. This was successful. When the economy failed, it was an opportunity. In September of 1930, the Nazis received 18% of the vote, 107 seats. In 1930, the chancellor, a man named Heinrich Brüning, could not form a working government and ruled under an emergency decree from Hindenburg, pretty much destroying democracy. Hitler now saw his opportunity. If he wanted to be in charge, he just needed to be named chancellor. So Hitler begins to work Hindenburg to be named chancellor from 30 to 33. At first, without a whole lot of success, though Hindenburg is probably suffering from some form of dementia. Eventually, his son, Hindenburg's son, will work on him on Hitler's behalf. By 1932, the Nazi Party had 800,000 members with 500,000 stormtroopers. Think about that. Remember, after World War I, the National Army of Germany was only allowed to have 100,000 soldiers. Hitler has a private army 5 times larger than the National Army. As I mentioned, he crossed the country in big campaign trips, and he promised to create a Germany without class difference. In July of 32, Nazis won 230 seats, the largest party in the Reichstag, still not a majority. November, they fell to 196 seats. Industrial magnates, aristocrats, military men, and high bureaucrats saw Hitler as the perfect dictator they could control. They believed that this would save Germany. They pressured Hindenburg, and Hitler was named chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Hitler promised there would only be 3 Nazis in his cabinet. He even had a non-Nazi vice chancellor who thought he could control Hitler. But obviously it didn't work. Now here's the thing. It sounds good to say you're only going to pick 3 cabinet members, but think about the American presidential cabinet. Some cabinet positions are more influential than others. For instance, Department of Defense is more important than the people who are in charge of our national parks. So within a few months, Hitler will be ready to take over Germany. Hermann Göring, who lives from 1893 to 1946, became the Minister of the Interior, which meant he was in charge of the police force of the Prussian state, which was the largest in the country. He then purged the police of non-Nazis and established an auxiliary force of stormtroopers. This made Nazi terror legitimate. A fire will break out in the Reichstag on February 27, 1933. Hitler said that it was done by the communists, and Hitler convinced Hindenburg to issue a decree giving emergency powers to the government. It suspended all basic rights of citizens, meant they were able to arrest and imprison without cause. On March 5th, 1933, the Nazis gained 288 votes, still not an absolute majority. He then pushed for a bill that could suspend all constitutional forms of government for 4 years while they dealt with Germany's problems. 2/3 of the Reichstag had to vote for it. Only the Social Democrats opposed it. It passed anyway. Hitler no longer needed the Reichstag or Hindenburg. He began putting German organizations under German control, Nazi control. The civil services were purged of Jews and democratic elements. Concentration camps were set up for his opponents. States' rights were ended. Trade unions were eliminated. All political parties except for the Nazis were abolished. By the summer of 33, Hitler has power. In the end of 33, there are only 2 sources of potential danger to Hitler: the armed forces and his own stormtroopers led by Ernest Röhm. Ernest Röhm had criticized Hitler. He said they needed a second revolution, and he had pushed to replace the army with the stormtroopers. Hitler and the army did not want that. So on June 30th, 1934, Hitler had Röhm and other SA leaders killed to gain army support. Thus, the army allowed Hitler to become president and chancellor when Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934. Hitler was now the supreme ruler. Public officials and soldiers had to take a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler. He was called the Führer, of the German Reich and people. On August 19th, 1934, they held a plebiscite vote. Uh, the question was, do you want to begin the Third Reich, an Aryan state that will dominate Europe and the world for 1,000 years, or do you want to go back to democracy? 85% voted for the Third Reich. So Hitler has his Nazi state. He wanted the people to be actively involved. He used mass demonstrations as spectacles. One of the symbols of the Nazi Party was the witch, a misunderstood German woman who was maligned. German nationalism, the Volk, will be used as a tool. Hitler will hold festivals. There will be struggles within the party and bureaucracy. Hitler welcomed that. It made him the ultimate decision maker. He gained control of the economy but did not nationalize industry. He was asked why he didn't take over industry. He said it didn't matter who ran the factories as long as they knew he was their master. He controlled grants and public through grants and public works. This helps employment. Unemployment will drop to 2.6 million in 1934 and then less than 500,000 in 1937. The Nazis will claim credit for the economic revival. He also wanted to make sure that he kept workers happy with leisure time. He will use his SS, which is basically his private guard for terror and coercion. It started as his personal guard under a true believer named Heinrich Himmler. The SS will control the regular and secret police functioning on terror and ideology, will use terror, repression, and murder. Later, they will be execution and death squads and will oversee the final solution. As the SS and Hitler wanted the mastery of the Aryan race, institutions like churches and schools came under Nazi control. They worked on early indoctrination of the youth through groups like the Hitler Youth and the German Girls Association. On April 1st, 1933, he called for a 2-day boycott of Jewish businesses, beginning a series of laws against non-Aryans. They were banned from legal profession, teachings, medicine, etc. In 1935, new racial laws called the Nuremberg Laws were announced, excluding German Jews from citizenship and forbidding marriage between Jews and Germans. Now, you might think, well, people can still shack up. Well, they forbade extramarital affairs too. And then things tapped down in 1936 because Hitler hosted the Olympics. It was one of the biggest telecasts in the world. It's actually the first broadcast to ever leave our solar system, by the way, is Hitler. That's why people don't visit us. After the Olympics, we began to see a violent phase against the Jews from 1938 to 39. On November 9th to the 10th, 1938, is what we call Crystal Knot or Crystal Night. It was brought about by the assassination of the third Secretary General at the German consulate in France by a Polish Jew. This led to a Nazi destructive rampage. Synagogues were burned, 7,000 businesses were destroyed, 100 Jews were killed. Now, here's the thing, they had insurance. The insurance company went to Hitler and says, do we have to pay? And Hitler said, you absolutely have to pay. You're going to pay me and the government. He then blamed the Jewish community for the destruction of their own community, fined them 1 billion marks for the damage. 30,000 Jewish males were sent to concentration camps. Jews were barred from public buildings and eventually would not be allowed to work in retail stores. Jews will be encouraged to leave Germany. We're going to obviously talk more about the Holocaust as we go on. How did they view women? Women were seen as childbearers. So that's Nazi Germany. That's the beginning. All right. Just to say, like I said, I'm going to try to find a video. Joseph Stalin will become a dictator in the Soviet Union after Lenin dies. Joseph Stalin. Stalin's not his real name. It means man of steel. He actually came to the forefront after robbing a bank to fund the Nazi part or the Bolshevik Party. He is a terrible person. He's actually, in fact, will be more of a mass murderer than Hitler. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this video, before we get to the war itself, is the Spanish Civil War. Now, I also have a book recommendation. George Orwell wrote a book called Homage to Catalonia, which was about his attempt to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Now, here's what's going on. In Spain, they aren't able to hold on to a parliamentary system like other places. So let's begin in 1923. The parliament could not hold on. With the support of King Alfonso XIII, a general named Miguel Primo de Rivera led a military coup in 1923. He will rule until 1930. The Great Depression causes his regime to fall. Also, a lack of support for the monarch. Alfonso XIII left Spain in 1931. A new republic was instituted, and it was governed by a coalition of Democrats and reformist socialists. Soon there was political turmoil. Government power went from left to right until the Popular Front came to power. The Popular Front was an anti fascist coalition composed of Democrats, socialists, and the revolutionary left. They took power in 1936. The problem was, under the leadership, they weren't very popular with the army officers. Under the leadership of General Francisco Franco, military leaders revolted against the government, starting a bloody 3-year war. There will be a great deal of foreign intervention in this war. Franco will receive support from fascist Italy and Germany. In fact, Germany and Italy, well, Mussolini and Hitler become closer during this. Hitler will use the war to test his new weaponry, especially the Luftwaffe, his new Air Force. I want you to look up a Pablo Picasso painting called Guernica. Just Google it. It is an abstract viewing of some of the destruction of the Luftwaffe. Please check that out. Hitler and Mussolini gave army, money, and men to Franco. The Popular Front appealed to the democratic nations for assistance. Only the Soviet Union provided trucks, planes, and tanks, which meant that the US, France, and others would not get involved because of the Soviet involvement. However, international brigades of volunteers came from those nations. From the US came the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. As I mentioned, Orwell tried to fight from Britain. Franco was eventually able to wear down the Popular Front, capturing Madrid on March 28, 1939. 400,000 will die during the war, only a fourth of those on the battlefield. Civilians will die from air raids and disease. 200,000 will be executed after Franco's victory. General Franco will establish a dictatorship that will last until 1975. Not fascist, but not opposed to fascism. Favored large landowners and the Catholic clergy. Now, the reason I mention this is because this really truly was a dress rehearsal for World War II. Showed us how destructive it would be. Now, in the next video, we're going to kind of look at the prelude to war, the 1930s up to the beginnings of the war. We'll get into the beginnings of the war, and then we'll finally get to the United States. So this is video 1. This is the background. And I shall talk to you soon with the next video after this one uploads. See you soon.